I kind of racked my brain of what would be a good thing to talk about. At first I thought a presentation on Major John Dean from Freetown, Freetown's Medal of Honor winner during the American Civil War, would be an interesting topic to talk about. The problem was my external hard drive. I couldn't find the right cord for it to get onto my external hard drive where all of those resources live. It would not be as fun to not look at actual letters and stuff and actual resources from John Dean. So I decided to not do that, and I decided instead to talk about a very local and specific story, something that my dissertation was all about, Confederate commerce raiders during the American Civil War, and specifically their effect on New Bedford's whaling industry. So we'll be talking a lot about local stories of what was happening with the whaling industry during the American Civil War and how all of those stories tie together. I want to start, though, by taking us to a late afternoon in June of 1865, June 28th of 1865 to be exact. This is now several months after Robert E. Lee has surrendered at Appomattox. Joseph E. Johnson has surrendered his army in the Carolinas to William T. Sherman. President Lincoln has been assassinated. Now, all this has happened about 2.5 months or so prior to these events culminating. And usually when I say the American Civil War, your mind may immediately go to battlefields in Virginia or in Pennsylvania or somewhere deep in the American South. Most people do not immediately go to the Bering Sea off the coast of Alaska and Russia in June of 1865 when you say the American Civil War. But in June of 1865, the American Civil War is still alive and well, as we will see here, for the New Bedford Whalers who find themselves there in June of 1865. One of those whale ships at that point was the Favorite. The Favorite was technically from Fairhaven at that point, though. New Bedford and Fairhaven very much viewed still as one entity. And Captain Thomas G. Young was the master of the whale ship Favorite. And he is standing defiantly on top of his cabin, brandishing revolvers and bomb guns. At this point, this is in the very early days of bomb gun technology, where they would use what basically looked similar to like a shotgun almost to shoot the harpoon towards a whale. So we're at the very early days of that type of technology. Young is standing on top of his captain's quarters with revolvers and this bomb gun. He's ready for a fight. His courage, his crew members would tell us, was perhaps inspired by liquor rather than anything else. But he was going to stand stout in the face of this Confederate commerce raider known as the CSS Shenandoah. He determined that his ship would not be one of the 31 New Bedford whale ships that had fallen to Confederate pirates since 1862. Fearful for their captain's life, his crew pleads with him, "Please, Captain, stand down. There's no point. You're not going to make a difference." Young says, "I only have 4 or 5 years left to live anyways, and I might as well die now as any other time, especially as all I have is invested in my vessel, and if I lose that, I will die now and go home penniless and die a pauper." His crew is not sympathetic, though, to their captain's plea with his desire to heroically die on his whale ship. Before abandoning their captain, the crew members removed the percussion caps from his revolvers and his bomb guns, rendering all of those pieces useless. As a boarding party from the CSS Shenandoah, the feared Confederate commerce raider, neared, one of the officers from the Shenandoah would call out to Captain Young to stand down and stand off. Young pretty much yells back, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm here to fight. You want to take this ship? Come get it from me." The captain again insisted for the officer from the Shenandoah, again insisted for Young to stand down, and Young replied, quote, "Blow away my buck, but may I be eternally blasted if I haul down that," pointing at the American flag, "for any cursed pirate that ever floated," end quote. With that, Young pulled one of the triggers on one of his bomb guns. Click. No percussion cap, the gun would not fire. At that point, Young, again perhaps inspired by alcohol more than anything else, decided that the better part of his judgment would be to stand down, and he would surrender his vessel to the Confederate commerce raiders. Young's stand gained an almost mythic status here in New Bedford. Headlines in the local newspaper proclaimed the man who defied Waddell, the pirate. Waddell is the captain of the CSS Shenandoah, Lieutenant Waddell. We'll talk a lot about him tonight. He stands as this prime example again and again in many of these newspapers as the one New Bedford whaler who really stood up against this dreaded pirate, as they would have always referred to him here in these local papers. One account said, quote, "He exhibited a brave and determined spirit, worthy of a Yankee captain." It's interesting when you consider that he may have been drunk while doing so. And yet to many of these individuals here in New Bedford, and including one early chronicler by the name of Ellis concluded when talking about this specific example here in the late 19th century that, quote, "Enough has been given to show how much the whaling industry had been crippled by the American Civil War." I would argue that in many ways these conclusions may be flawed. Young has become in many ways a straw man. His grand tale of desperation was fueled by liquid courage rather than moral fortitude, and several accounts, most notably from Lieutenant Cornelius Hunt of the Shenandoah, indicated that, quote, "he was 3 sheets to the wind when he was captured." This drunken, ill-advised stand symbolized for many historians how the war financially destroyed those involved in the whaling industry. Remember Young's own lines, right? "I will go home penniless and die a pauper." The story of the crew members who attempted to convince their captain to stand down, I think, is more illustrative of how most in New Bedford reacted. Contrary to popular belief, these men were not resigned to defeat, but they engineered a different kind of victory than Young imagined. Yes, they survived capture, but they experienced more success than just that. This victory came in the months and the years that followed the war, with payments from insurance claims and in an international tribunal, which would be world-renowned as the Alabama claims. Even Young, prepared to die rather than be captured, recouped all of his losses through insurance payments made almost a year after this event in 1866. He did not die a pauper as he prophesied, but rather lived out the remainder of his life comfortably in New Bedford. Most New Bedford whalers enjoyed similar success. With insurance and international claims recouping all of their losses, significant capital would flow into New Bedford in the years following the American Civil War. But how do we get to that point? How do we get there? Of course, we know our story of New Bedford here, this great whaling port which really starts to become America's predominant whaling port by the mid-19th century. At first, Nantucket in the late 18th century is really kind of the home to whaling. But New Bedford has several advantages over Nantucket, which slowly leads in those early decades of the 19th century to the transition of the American whaling industry kind of being at heart, its home in Nantucket, and moving here to New Bedford. By the time of the American Civil War, and just the years prior in the 1850s, there are over 300 whaling vessels that make up the fleet here, and millions of dollars coming into the port annually thanks to those products taken from the whale. This made New Bedford at that point one of the richest cities in the country. But by the 1850s, we noticed something. There is a glut in the market. There's so many whale ships going out and abroad, producing so much product. The good old, laws of supply and demand, right? The more supply there is, and as demand starts to diminish with the discovery of petroleum and other things similar to petroleum, which make it easier to light the interior of buildings or to light the interior of homes at that time, we're going to start to see a glut in the market. And so prices are going to start to drop. And right in the years before the American Civil War, we see a slight recession, if you will, in the whaling industry. Many people, when you read the whaleman's shipping list, which I always say, think of the Wall Street Journal of the whaling industry, the whaleman's shipping list. It is a periodical that's put out that gives you pretty much headlines, stories, articles, what's the latest prices, who's coming to port, who's leaving what port. It basically breaks down everything that's happening. By the late 1850s, as you start to read the whaleman's shipping list, you start to realize many of these merchants in New Bedford especially are becoming a little uneasy with what's happening in this whaling industry and in this market. It's becoming less and less profitable to send whaling ships abroad. As the Civil War breaks out, many of the whaling ships in the fleet have aged out, are growing older and older. Thank you, sir. We know, of course, I should have said this first, the close connections with New Bedford and the Underground Railroad and its involvement in the Underground Railroad. And don't underestimate the close connections that had with southern ports. New Bern and the Carolinas especially. There are several specific ports again and again in the Carolinas and New Bedford. They have like a war feuding in the newspapers going back and forth because New Bedford is known as this port that is harboring people who have self-liberated themselves from slavery. One of them, of course, one of the most famous who ever lived here in New Bedford for a time, being Frederick Douglass. Whole talk in and of itself about Frederick Douglass in New Bedford, but it is worth noting those close connections with the Underground Railroad in New Bedford. Next slide, please. When we get to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861, the Anaconda Plan will be instituted. It's an idea that is instituted by the commander of the Union armies at the time, Winfield Scott, and it is a primary part of this blockade of the American South. The idea that we're going to blockade all of these southern ports and try to cut off all trade through these southern ports. The problem with that idea is that the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy at that time, is only comprised of about 40 vessels, 40 seagoing vessels, a little over 40 seagoing vessels. When you're talking about thousands of miles of southern ports that need to be blockaded, 40 vessels, most of which are not even here, but are abroad in the international seas doing work elsewhere in the world, not going to cut it. So this forces the Navy Department to get a little creative. How are we going to blockade some of these points? One of the ports, one of the ideas is to purchase older merchant marine vessels and sink them in southern harbors. A great example of this will be the New Bedford Whalers, about 26 in all that are purchased in late 1861 into early 1862. They are sailed down to Charleston, South Carolina. They are filled with local rock from local farms. Predominantly, there's a great story of local farmers going out and tearing down all of their stone walls in order to provide all of this rock to the American government. In order to sink these ships, they sail them down to Charleston, they sink them, and effectively they blockade Charleston Harbor. A year later, a U.S. Army commissioner will go and survey the condition of those ships and will say, it didn't work at all. The ships that were sunk had opened up new channels because it had changed the flow of the current. So new channels had opened. They had tried to block the original channels. It never worked. And the ships that were still there were in such a dilapidated state at that point that they were not even effective blockades themselves anymore. But the Stone Fleet, a part of this story, where I would argue the Stone Fleet is an important part to what's happening here in New Bedford and the economy here in New Bedford, is that these old ships, most of which had been sitting in the dock for years at that point, right? Think of this as a cash for clunkers kind of deal almost, right? You got that old car in the yard, you don't really know what to do with it, right? Somebody will give you cash for it, right? The American government, the U.S. government, is offering $2,500 to $5,000 in 1861 currency for some of these old vessels, which most of them are relatively ineffective as sailing vessels anymore, right? It's a no-brainer for these merchants who sell these vessels to the U.S. government, right? It's quick capital, and you're turning what is a really useless capital at that point, degrading capital, capital that is losing its value over time, into cash that you can then invest in other things, either other whaling ships or, as we'll see, in other businesses as well. We can hit the next slide there. The Confederate government is going to react to this Anaconda Plan by instituting several policies, one of which is issuing letters of marque and reprisal to individual citizens. The reason why I want to talk about this briefly is because there is a distinctive difference between letters of marque and reprisal and what happens in early 1861 and what a Confederate commerce raider is. A letter of marque, that dates back centuries literally, right? Your original pirates, many of whom, those famous pirates, got their start by governments issuing them letters of marque. It's basically government-sanctioned piracy. I'm going to give you a letter of marque which indicates that you as a private citizen in ownership of your own vessel have a right to act on behalf of a government, whether that's England, France, whatever, Spain at that time. The Confederate government is saying, hey, you own a ship, I'm going to give you a letter of marque. That gives you as a private owner, a private individual owning that ship, the right to attack on behalf of the Confederate government, U.S. merchant mariner trade and networks. So these are private citizens who have been given these special letters of marque in order to attack the U.S. merchant marine during the Civil War. What we see largely throughout all of history, letters of marque are not always effective, and oftentimes it just leads to more problems for the governments that are issuing them. Think Pirates of the Caribbean, right? Many of them get started as sanctioned pirates, and what do they end up doing in the end? Turning on the governments that had sanctioned them in the first place. So not usually a very effective way to do things, but the Confederate government is making this decision because they don't have a navy, right? But they do have private individuals who own ships who may be able to use those ships to their advantage. We can see that in the Whaleman Shipping List and other papers here in New Bedford, again and again, there is huge cry against this. This is not fair war, as they would have said. Quote, "The letters of marque and reprisal is a war upon private property and stands in marked disgraceful contrast with that of the President's proclamation in which he declares that the rights of private property shall be respected. The next step of Confederates in rebellion will be to confiscate all debts from Southern men to Northern creditors," end quote. That's written in April of 1861. But this is only the beginning. And as we see, the letters of marque and reprisal proved fairly ineffective, especially when we're looking at the whaling industry in the United States at that time. Only 3 whalers across the entire country were captured by pirates sponsored by the Confederate government, and all 3 of them are based out of Provincetown. So no New Bedford whalers are captured as a result of these Confederate pirates that are operating under these letters of marque. But this does give the Confederate government the idea to take this one step further. And this is kind of the inception of the idea of the Confederate commerce raider. Hit the next slide, please. The idea of a Confederate commerce raider, this is not a private citizen, this is not a private crew that is being given this letter of marque to operate on behalf of the Confederate government. This is a Confederate naval vessel owned by the Confederate government with a crew that is commissioned officers and sailors in the Confederate Navy. These are not private individuals, these are not pirates in that sense, that they're private individuals, governmentally sponsored. These are commissioned officers and sailors in the Confederate Navy. And these are commissioned naval vessels in the Confederate Navy. That is a distinctive difference that people like Semmes, eventually here we see him on the top, Raphael Semmes, the commander of the CSS Sumter, and later more famously the CSS Alabama, and Waddell, the commander of the Shenandoah, will make a distinction with. They will say that they are not pirates. They are naval officers in the Confederate Navy operating under that jurisdiction. The clear difference, though, is that these Confederate commerce raiders are not ordered to attack U.S. naval vessels, they're ordered to attack U.S. merchant vessels. They would argue that this is akin to a William T. Sherman moving through Georgia. That would be the argument that they would make, right? Sherman deliberately trying to attack the economy of the South. They would argue that this is akin to that, just in a naval form. So there is a clear difference there. Launched in Birkenhead Iron Works in Liverpool on July 29th of 1862, the CSS Alabama will start to sail the world's oceans. Semmes, when we look at this individual, Raphael Semmes, the commander of the Alabama, he's an interesting character with an interesting background. When you look at what he did before the war, he's working for the U.S. Navy, as most Confederate naval officers were, and most Army officers were, right? Most of them were in the U.S. Army or in the U.S. Navy prior to the war. Semmes is no different. Semmes is the superintendent of lighthouses prior to the American Civil War. That's interesting. What is one of the primary illuminants in lighthouses all up and down the East Coast at that time and into the Midwest? Whale oil. That's no mistake. Semmes has a personal connection here in New Bedford and with the whaling industry as a whole here in New England because of what he has done prior to the war. He knows exactly how the whaling industry works too. When you think of a merchant vessel trading goods, for example, right? There are certain paths, certain tracks that a vessel will follow due to the prevailing winds at any given latitude, right? There are certain courses that are pretty heavily traveled by merchant vessels. But in many ways, trying to find one isolated vessel in a place as big and as vast as the Atlantic Ocean is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. He knows, though, that whalers have a disadvantage because whalers, much like whales, will congregate in certain parts of the world at certain seasons because of how the whales feed, how they reproduce, where they spend different parts of their year. You can hit the next slide. And so Semmes knows this, and he writes in his own accounts in his memoirs that, quote, "I resolved to strike a blow at the enemy's whale fisheries off of the Azores." We can hit the next slide again, please. Thank you. And so what's happening here, remember, Semmes, the Alabama, is an English-made vessel. It's made in England. It's launched in Birkenhead. And so he is getting started over here in England. And Semmes knows that thanks to that thing called the Gulf Stream, late in the summer, at this time of year when he's launching from England, late July into August, the Gulf Stream carries millions and millions of krill and other small fish, organisms, I don't know, I'm not a scientist. It carries krill and other kind of animals like that right off the coast of the Azores. And that makes right off the coast of the Azores the perfect feeding ground for the North Atlantic right whale. So it shouldn't surprise us that many New Bedford whaling vessels would leave New Bedford early in the year, somewhere in May, June, July, kind of early summer-ish. And the first stop that they would make on their way to the Pacific whaling grounds would be to stop off the coast of the Azores in the late summer, early fall to capitalize on those feeding seasons. This is an easy way for them to start to fill up their vessels on the first part of their trip, the first leg of their trip. Semmes knows that. And he knows that whalers are always going to be congregated together in that one place. There's this feeding frenzy, and they're going to try to capitalize on that, the whalers, and that means that they're all sitting ducks there in many ways. We can hit the next slide. Semmes said this, quote, "Unlike the ships of commerce, the whalers are obliged to congregate within small, well-known spaces of ocean and remain there for weeks at a time, whilst the whaling season lasts. It was the most obvious thing in the world that these vessels, thus clustered together, should attract the attention of a Confederate cruiser." End quote. In about 5 days, the Alabama will successfully capture 4 New Bedford whalers on 4 separate occasions, costing the city of New Bedford about $71,000 in damages that one day. At the end of Semmes' voyage, they had captured a total of 16 whaling vessels, with exactly half of those 8 being from New Bedford. So the total in destruction was about $218,000 worth of product, which would equate, of course, this is an imperfect math, but would equate to about $3 million in today's currency. Between the Stone Fleet and Semmes' actions in the early part of the American Civil War, New Bedford's whale fleet was reduced by 25%. A 25% fleet reduction thanks to merchants selling their vessels as part of the Stone Fleet and the destruction of whalers at the hands of the Alabama and the Sumter and a few other lesser-known Confederate commerce raiders. But this brings us, if we want to hit the next slide, we'll see where this takes us. We can go through, I already went over all that. This brings us now to the CSS Shenandoah, the main driving force of our story tonight, because no other Confederate cruiser would do as much damage to New Bedford's whaling fleet as the CSS Shenandoah. James Bullock, the Confederate chief operative in England, was the one that procured the vessel that would become the Shenandoah. He was intentionally looking for an iron-framed, full-rigged ship that had auxiliary steam power, and he found the vessel known as the Sea King. Bullock will purchase the Sea King on behalf of the Confederate government. Wink, wink. The English knew nothing about this. Wink, wink. And the ship will be rechristened the CSS Shenandoah. Waddell will be selected, James Waddell will be selected as the commander of this vessel. And the interesting part about the Shenandoah is right from the very beginning, right from the start, the Confederate government, you know, the Alabama and Semmes, the Confederate government just says attack the merchant marine of the North, right? Attack those merchant vessels, try to destroy as many of them as you can. The orders that Waddell gets is very specific, and it's very focused on one particular merchant marine industry, whaling industry. On October 5th, 1864, Bullock will send orders which have been forwarded to him by the Secretary of the Navy himself, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, which read, quote, and I think if we hit the slide here, we'll have it on the screen. Maybe not. There's James Waddell, who will be the commander, the captain of this vessel, Lieutenant James Waddell. We'll hit the next slide. Look at that. Almost like I knew what was on my own PowerPoint. On October 5th, 1864, Waddell will read these orders. Quote, "Sir, you are to proceed upon a cruise in the far distant Pacific, into the seas and among the islands frequented by the great American whaling fleet, a source of abundant wealth to our enemies and a nursery for their seamen. It is hoped that you may be able to greatly damage and disperse that fleet, even if you do not succeed in utterly destroying it." So make no qualms about it, right? What is Waddell's objective, according to the Secretary of the Navy of the Confederacy? The whaling fleet of the Northeast. With a largely English crew, Waddell and his Confederate officers will head out to the Pacific, setting sail in late October. Notice again, where is this vessel coming from? England. Where was the Alabama made? England. Largely an English crew serving on behalf of the Confederate government, but all of the commissioned officers on the vessel are from the American South. So there's an interesting mix here. Keep that in mind, because as we get into a few minutes from now, we'll talk a little bit about the Alabama claims and how all of this factors into that legally. On December 4th, 1864, the Shenandoah is in the South Atlantic, and it's there that they're going to capture their first whaler. It will be the Edward of New Bedford. Captain Charles P. Worth, the commander of the Edward, the master of the Edward from New Bedford, described the weather that day as being quote-unquote thick. The Edward sat idle in a cloud of thick fog, and the reason why it was sitting idle is because, if we hit the next slide, please. Thank you. A map of the world. The Shenandoah is making its way down from England, and somewhere here in the South Atlantic, they're going to run into the Edward. We'll hit the next slide again. This shows you how they're going to make their way over to the Pacific. So they're deliberately going to go down and around Africa, over into the Indian Ocean, and up into the Pacific Ocean. Before they make their return voyage to England, they'll go the opposite way. So they'll literally circumvent the world by the end of their year-plus voyage. We'll hit the next slide. This image demonstrates the process known as cutting in. Typically, I'll spare you all of the details. You can read Herman Melville if you want ad nauseum detail of the process of killing a whale in Moby Dick. We always laugh about some of those earlier books like Les Mis and like other things like Moby Dick, right? They get into this ad nauseum detail that takes you away from the main storyline about what life was like. But there's some fascinating stories in there, first-hand accounts from Melville, who himself had gone out on a whaling voyage, of how this process worked. You would kill a whale, We would at first identify a whale. The men would go out in their whale boats, in those long boats. They would row out to the whale. The harpooner standing at the very front of the whale would throw the harpoon. Think of the harpoon as a hook. The harpoon does not kill the whale. It hooks you to the whale. Ideally, you can get multiple harpoons into a whale, which will bring it to an easier, quicker demise. If not, you're in for a little Nantucket sleigh ride, a journey, a harrowing journey across the open ocean as this very angry whale that you've now harpooned is dragging your whale ship across the open ocean. Finally, eventually, the whale hopefully will tire, and you can, one of the members of the crew on this whale boat will come up with the killing lance, which will strike the final blow. At that point, you're going to bring the whale back to the ship. I want you to think of that ship as a factory. It's going to turn into a processing plant. They're going to start to cut into this whale, cutting back these massive sheets of blubber, as you see here, which are rendered down into oil right on the ship in massive kilns called the try-works. Not bad. It's been like 7 years since I've talked about this, so I can't believe I remembered this whole process. It's like ingrained in my mind. That's the process that these whalers are doing as the Shenandoah sneaks up in this thick fog. They don't see them, is the reality of it. They're so busy doing their work, there's such a thick fog, they're able to just sail right up to them. They find them. Captain Worth will surrender his vessel, and the crew of the Shenandoah will spend the next 2 days stripping the vessel of all valuable material. Keep in mind, this is the beginning of the Shenandoah's cruise, right? So if there's anything on this vessel that's of potential value, and the Edward had just left New Bedford, so they're fully stocked with all of their supplies, right? They're going to bring all of those supplies that they can potentially use onto their vessel. They're going to light the ship on fire, destroying any product that was on board and destroying the vessel as a whole. And then they're going to dump the crew on an island and they're going to parole them and let someone find them. And hopefully someone will find them. In every case, these paroled individuals, they get dumped in different places. They're usually dumped in major cities or towns or ports somewhere. They don't dump them in the middle of the ocean where they have no hope of being found. They're usually placed in a place that someone's going to find them eventually, and they will be paroled. The prize was worth about $20,000, so about $20,000 in destruction that happens as a result of this. In a letter written by Captain Worth, dated January 10th of 1865, indicated the psychological effect, though, of this capture on him and the crew member. In exasperation, Worth wrote, quote, "We were robbed of everything we possessed but our clothing, and part of that even was stolen on board the Shenandoah. We were boiling our first whale when captured, which would have yielded about 100 barrels of oil. My officers, crew, and myself are dependent upon the U.S. consul at this place." They eventually make their way to Cape Town, so he's in Cape Town when he's writing this. "Not one of us with a single dollar left to spend," end quote. The Shenandoah will continue on without much excitement from that point, making their way across the Indian Ocean and eventually arriving in Melbourne, Australia. We can hit the next slide and we'll see where that takes us. Oh, that's the Worth quote. So eventually they'll arrive in Australia. There they're going to refit. And an interesting thing happens, actually. When the Shenandoah arrives in Australia, they're met with great fanfare. People come out in droves in Melbourne to see this Confederate commerce raider and to see this Confederate crew. Waddell will not allow any of the local folk living in Melbourne to join his crew, but it's said that when they get out to sea, people started to come out of the woodwork. So Australians now, English still at that point, of course, right? But these people who are living in Australia are actually enlisting kind of by force in the Shenandoah. Interesting story. I guess they're out for the adventure of it all. But one of the officers on the Shenandoah will say, Australians began to come out of the woodwork once they got out to sea. After a brief layover in Melbourne to refit, the Shenandoah headed north to the Caroline Islands. It was in the harbor of Ascension Island that they would make their next pivotal discoveries. 4 vessels lay at anchor in the harbor. We can hit the next slide. I don't know if there's anything horribly exciting. Oh, there's the Caroline Islands. So we're talking north of New Guinea and Micronesia, really, that this is all happening, so that part of the world. 4 vessels lay at anchor in the harbor there, and all were American whalers. One ship, the Hector, was from New Bedford, but all 4 were valuable prizes. After the Confederates took everything that they saw of value off of the ships, they allowed the locals to also loot the ships in exchange for holding the whalers prisoners for them. Then all 4 vessels were set on fire. This cost the master of the Hector and its investors about $58,000 in damages. However, Waddell procured something even more valuable from these 4 vessels, and that was the charts of the Northern Pacific whale grounds. On board whaling vessels, the masters of those whaling ships would keep intricate notes, right? That is the bread and butter of whaling. Those experienced captains having those intricate notes of where at certain times of year those whales would congregate. And that could be the difference between a really successful cruise, finding those whales, or not. It's no different today, right? Sometimes you'll watch some of these shows on National Geographic or whatever where this fisherman, right, going out, whether it's the crabbers up in Alaska or whatever, right? And they always talk about their logs, right? Trying to keep track of where their source of income is at any given time. Animals are fairly predictable based upon patterns, and whales were no different. With these Northern Atlantic whaling ground log books in his hand, Waddell now doesn't have to guess where the whale ships are. He knows exactly where the whale fleet will most likely be based upon these logbooks. This is a key to his success. Waddell jubilantly recalled in his memoir, quote, "With such charts in my possession, I not only held the key to the navigation of the Pacific Island, the Okhotsk and Bering Seas, and the Arctic Ocean, but the most probable localities for finding the great Arctic whaling fleet of New England without a tiresome search," end quote. Thank you for advancing the slide. Waddell now held the tools in his hand which would help him to bring to fruition Bullock's orders. Waddell now turned the Shenandoah north and arrived off the Kamchatka Peninsula by late May of 1865. We can hit the next slide here. By this time of year, in the reaches of the North Pacific, the solid masses of ice are beginning to break up. As summer starts to come about in that region, those solid chunks of ice starting to break up and yielding way for the whaling fleet to move into those very lucrative Arctic whaling grounds. Think, Arctic whales are suited to survive in cold water. It means they got a lot of what? Blubber to help them survive, which means a lot of product. So they're going to move into that region of the world there in late May of 1865. Waddell's men sight a Yankee whaler in the distance in the midst of the breaking flow. And one of the more comical stories in all of this is going to happen as the Abigail is the whale ship that is sighted. The Abigail is on the opposite side of a massive ice chunk, though. And so the Abigail sees this vessel approaching, and they're going to start to try to sail away. And the Shenandoah is going to chase them. The problem is they have this massive ice chunk in between the two of them. So it's almost like a cartoon as they have this little chase going. Unfortunately for the Abigail, they're not able to get away before the ice chunk breaks up, and the Shenandoah is able to capture them. Waddell sent out his boarding parties. At this point, it was pretty common for Waddell, and one thing that gets him into a lot of trouble, he will make claims like, oh, we were no different than Sherman. We did the same exact thing, right? We're attacking the northern economy, blah, blah, blah. One of Waddell's practices, though, and a practice of a few Confederate commerce raiders, was to fly a foreign nation's flag prior to capturing these vessels. Waddell, at the time of this capture, is flying the Russian flag of the Russian Empire. So the Abigail thinks that it's actually a Russian naval vessel that is following them, trying to capture them. Point in fact, as they're about to capture them, they strike the Russian colors and they raise the Confederate Navy Jack. So that will get Waddell into some trouble because he is using this deceptive ploy to try to attack and capture these vessels. The master of the Abigail is Captain Ebenezer Nye. After expressing his disbelief, the boarding officer from the Shenandoah is going to arrive on the vessel and is going to begin the process of processing this vessel. And Nye is like, "What the heck are you doing here?" I'm paraphrasing here the exact quote. "What are you doing here? Why is there a Confederate commerce raider in the Arctic? This is the one place in the whole world that we thought we never would see you people, and now you're here." And the officer is going to retort back, I think one of the more witty quotes in the whole presentation, the inception of my dissertation title and the title of this presentation. The officer will remark back, quote, "We have entered into a treaty offensive and defensive with the whales, and we are up here by special agreement with the whale to dispose of their mortal enemy, you." End quote. This was not Nye's first encounter with a Confederate cruiser either. Several years before, Captain Nye's vessel, a different whaling vessel, had been captured by the CSS Alabama. One discouraged crew member proclaimed to Nye, quote, "You are more fortunate in picking up Confederate cruisers than whales. I will never again go with you, for if there is a cruiser out, you will find her," end quote. Not only had Captain Nye lost his ship and precious cargo, but his reputation was tainted. The Abigail gave the Confederates one other key important tool, and that was the vessel's second mate, a man by the name of Thomas S. Manning. Manning was originally from Baltimore. Starts out as a sailor in the area of Baltimore on different marine expeditions. Eventually he makes his way up here to New Bedford, will enlist. He is a second mate, so he is a very high-ranking officer on this vessel. He's third in command on this vessel, but he's from Baltimore, Maryland. Okay? When this opportunity presents itself that a Confederate commerce raider should capture this New Bedford whaler, and this gentleman from Baltimore, Maryland, remember, a border state during the Civil War, a slave-holding state during the Civil War, is going to capture this vessel, Manning has no qualms overturning coats and enjoining the crew of the Shenandoah. So Manning is going to defect and become a member of the Shenandoah's crew. This is even more key than those charts because Manning knows what? He has intimate knowledge of this season exactly where all of the vessels are. He's seen all the other whaling vessels in the fleet. He has personal knowledge of where they are located. And this is going to be a key to several more weeks of success. On June 21st and 22nd, the Shenandoah will capture 4 more New Bedford whalers and bond 1, an estimated total of $261,000 in damages. At this point, Waddell will receive reports from some of the crew members that Lincoln had been assassinated and Lee had surrendered. Because there are no newspapers, though, that indicate this as hard proof, Waddell will not believe them and will continue his cruise. This is very dangerous because on June 26th, the Shenandoah will catch 3 more prizes, and on June 27th will be the single most destructive day at the hands of a Confederate commerce raider. Early on the morning of June 27th, 1865, Waddell will spot 11 whale ships in the distance. The Shenandoah will capture the Waverly, which was kind of off on its own. They're going to capture it, they're going to process it, and burn it. A little after noon, they're going to approach the other 9 vessels, which were gathered all around one vessel, the Brunswick. What had happened was the Brunswick had lost the battle with an iceberg. Okay, the Brunswick had hit an iceberg. The ship was damaged beyond repair. It was not sinking like the Titanic, but it was slowly going to sink and it was not seaworthy anymore. So these other 9 vessels are going to gather around the Brunswick and begin the process of raffling off, for lack of a better term, auctioning off the contents of the ship and all of the whale oil and other things that have been processed and all the equipment and all that kind of stuff. So they're in the process of auctioning all this stuff off when all of a sudden the Shenandoah sails up and they're all sitting ducks, literally, with very little ability to do anything. The Shenandoah will fire a warning shot, and they will send out their longboats to encircle all of those vessels, and ultimately 8 of the 9 vessels will surrender almost instantly. 6 of them were from New Bedford. The one that does not surrender is our friend Captain Young from The Favorite. So we're back to the beginning of our presentation where we talked a little bit about Captain Young's stand, but even he too will surrender. The Shenandoah burned a total of $340,000 of value that day and bonded one vessel for $37,000. Thus, the total price to New Bedford merchants for this one day was $370,000, and that is currency at that time. That is more value than was destroyed by the Alabama in its entire 2-year cruise. One day, one single day of destruction at the hands of the Shenandoah. Waddell, at this point, is going to find something else on these whaling vessels, and that's newspapers. Newspapers which irrefutably, from San Francisco, prove that the war is over. And he starts to think better of continuing what he's going to do. He tries to figure out what he wants to do. He's not going to return to the United States for fear of being prosecuted for his actions. He will return to England, to Great Britain, and he will surrender to neutral authorities in Great Britain. Waddell, notably, although many here in New Bedford would have loved to see Waddell charged and ultimately convicted of piracy and the unpleasant end for those who are pirates, Waddell will never, he will spend some time in England. Eventually he will return to the United States. He will never be prosecuted for his actions in the Civil War. This does bring us to an important point, though, and we can hit a few more slides. That gives you an idea of kind of the total damages throughout the course of the war. We'll see here a very clear line chart showing the depletion of the whaling fleet in the years from really in earnest 1858, but 1860 in the start of the Civil War all the way to 1866 where we see a low point there. A little bit of a rise in the post-war years, but eventually another decline. We can hit the next slide. Just a few charts that show you kind of total numbers of whale fleets. So you'll see really starting in earnest with the time of the Civil War, a slow and pretty steady drop in the size of the U.S. whale fleet. We can hit the next slide. Prices for whale oil, again we see the total number of barrels being brought in. We see a decline over time. We can hit the next slide. This, we see the price do what during the Civil War? Go up. Eventually it will go back down and will begin its slow decline, right? But during the Civil War, fewer ships are going out, fewer products being brought back, right? Supply and demand, what does that do to the price? The price goes up, right? So we see a peak in price for whale oil and spermaceti during the Civil War. We can hit the next slide. And now this really brings us to the insurance claims. You know, these stories sound pretty horrific, right? All of these total losses, $370,000 in one single day, right? That sounds catastrophic for an industry, for an economy, doesn't it? When we look very closely, though, in the records, and we are so fortunate here in New Bedford, the New Bedford Whaling Museum, a fantastic institution, the amount of just pure data and knowledge that they house there in that institution is absolutely incredible. My friend Mark, who works there in the library, incredibly helpful. He has a great name, too. But they have a whole bunch of this, and I spent a whole lot of time in that reading room at the Whaling Museum looking at documents like this, insurance listings. And what we take away from these insurance listings and kind of the lessons of the Civil War is this. I will spare you a long-winded explanation of how whaling insurance works during the American Civil War and prior to the Civil War. What you need to know really is that most whaling vessels were getting charged about 5% on insurance rates, and they had an additional 5% premium throughout the course of the war. So the premiums that they're paying is about a 10% 5% premium throughout the course of the Civil War. That is very valuable for those who pay it, though, because we are going to see them recoup many of those losses. And something fascinating is that the merchants who own the ships, oftentimes one merchant does not own a single whale ship. Usually multiple merchants will own shares in a whale ship, right? That does a good job of spreading out the liability amongst different people, right? You can all kind of recoup losses. A lot of the same people are all investing in different whale ships. You see a lot of very weird fractions of ownership, like 4/32 and other things in all of these reports. Usually, you're going to have these individuals who have ownership in these vessels taking out insurance on the portion of the vessel that they own through an agent. So working through an agent firm here in New Bedford, the agent's going to go out to the insurance company, try to get the best rate, and they're going to purchase insurance on behalf of the actual owner. We also see not only insurance being purchased on the ship and the vessel and all of its products and tools on the vessel, but we also see insurance being taken out at times on the catching on the East Swift. It's not all that uncommon for whaling vessels and the masters on these vessels in their letters back home to inform the owners of how much whale oil was on the ship at the time. So that way, the owners of the vessel could go out with that knowledge and take out insurance on not just the ship, not just that hard physical capital, but also the product that they were putting on the vessel. We see again and again in many when we actually start to pinpoint these insurance documents and the ships that were destroyed. When we use that list of ships that were destroyed by the Alabama, by the Shenandoah, by the Sumter, and we cross-reference those with the insurance claims, most of these merchants who own the vessels, upwards of 90% of them are recouping at least the loss of the vessel through insurance payments. Up to 90% of them. And in many cases, some of them are even recouping the amount of oil, or roughly close to the amount of oil that was already caught on the ship. It takes a few months, it takes a lot of headache, right? But these people are being recouped those insurance payments. Upwards of 90% of them are recouping their insurance they're recouping their ownership through these insurance payments. The funny thing about that money too is it's not tied to any physical assets anymore, is it? You can take that money, you can reinvest in a different whale ship, you can do whatever you want with it. When we start to look at how much of this money is reinvested in these years after the Civil War, we start to see more and more of these whaling merchants start investing in textiles. It's no mistake, Wamsutta Mill, built in 1850, the first textile mill here, 1850s, maybe 1853, I forget the exact date, built right over here along Route 18. You drive by it if you come down Route 18 all the time. It's no mistake that we start to see many textile mills growing in the wake of the American Civil War here in New Bedford. Many of these whaling merchants have free capital that they can now reinvest in something new. At that point, steam has been invented. Water-powered mills, textile mills, are not so locked into those water power sources, good rivers for producing power, like the Blackstone or the Merrimack or the Concord. Now a place like the Acushnet River here, a perfect place to sail in coal, to be burned and to produce steam in these mills, right? It's a combining of forces, free capital and investment in something new, thanks to the Civil War. We can hit the next slide. Another key part to this is the Alabama claims. I will spare you a detailed, this could be a whole presentation in and of itself, what the Alabama claims was and what it wasn't. Ultimately, this is an international tribunal, an international court case, which is heard. Several countries are involved in this process. Ultimately, it's going to end with the decision that Great Britain, that the English government had intimate knowledge and in some cases actually built vessels and provided crews for some of these Confederate commerce raiders. And thus they should be held liable to the American merchants for the damage to those vessels. So what that is going to lead to is a payment of about $15,500,000. Through interest payments, it's going to ultimately total $16,292,607.26. $790,000 in interest payments accumulated in the years after the Civil War. This decision is made really in earnest in 1872 in a meeting in Geneva. Why not? Everything happens in Geneva. And the first payments start to arrive in March of 1877. So at that point, several years had elapsed and they're going to be charged the interest, $790,000 in total. The process that's going to be undergone by the State Department of how to repay these merchants is they are going to go out into each one of the communities and they are going to commission agents to work on behalf of the State Department. Here in New Bedford, that will be Clifford, and Crapo. It's a law office here of Charles Clifford, Ashley Clifford, and William Crapo. They're going to be officially commissioned as commissioners on the court, and they are going to adjudicate who gets these payments. Part of the process here is that an individual, a complainant, someone who is going to try to regain some of their money lost at the hands of Confederate Commerce Raiders, will come in, they will they will fill out a sheet, several pages long. It'll give all the details. This will be given to the State Department and final determinations, and either they will be granted the pay, partial pay, or no pay at all. Almost everybody who puts in a claim gets some kind of compensation from the claim. This is one of my favorites. It is given by Hannah P. Payne. Hannah P. Payne was then a widow. She is filing on behalf of her husband and her husband's ownership in a vessel that was destroyed by the Shenandoah, the Nassau. And so here we see kind of all of that basic information. What was the name of the ship? Who destroyed it? Some other basic information about who Hannah is, kind of what her deal is. We hit the next slide. A listing here of who the other owners in the ship were. So we see it broken down here by shares. Who are the other co-owners in the ship? Hannah Payne is listed as one of them, and you see some of the other ones. A Swift up there. Swift's a pretty common name here in New Bedford. You see another Swift listed here. So you see all of the owners and kind of what they owned. And then here, some of the money that they are arguing for. You see that all kind of listed out here. We'll hit the next page, next slide. And here, she is totaling out what the value of everything is that she owned as part of this whale vessel. So you see of the ship, Nassau, so that is her owning, her holding of what was on the ship. Her outfits is the second line, so her portion of the outfits, all of those tools that are necessary, and then her portion of the catchings on the Nassau at the time of destruction gives you a total number over here, which in the balance says she is owed about $7,784 in total. She will be granted this by the court, and so it's just kind of one simple breakdown of how this process would work. We can hit the next slide again. We see many people putting in claims. Some of them are formal claims, like Hannah for ownership in a ship. Others are individuals who are going to claim things that they lost in the process. So this one is from a captain, John Hallett, whose ship was destroyed throughout by, I believe, the Shenandoah. And we see here his nautical instruments that he wants, his nautical almanac, which was destroyed, a silver case watch, oak carved chair. So he's literally listing out all of his personal, one Bible, all of his personal belongings and how much that equates to, and he's submitting this payment. You see even individual crew members who have knowledge of this putting in things as simple as socks that they lost as a result of this. So really, in almost in every case, many of these people get their money. There is a great folder file from Clifford and Crapo, which holds much of the Alabama claims paperwork that they collected over several years. In all, Clifford Crapo's work led to members of 40 separate whaling vessels receiving payments of about $301,000. It was the work of these men and their clerks collecting mountains of information, letters, and affidavits that saw many in New Bedford prosper from the Alabama claims. William Crapo penned numerous letters to the State Department from 1872 to 1880 advocating for his clients, and these letters and the arguments he made served as the basis of the State Department's official report on the ruling and awards issued by the federal government, which was printed ultimately in 1886. This influx of capital came at a very convenient time, with industrial mills flourishing in New Bedford. Thanks to the rise of American steam-powered mills, this money helped to fund the construction of new mills. Many wealthy individuals like Matthew Howland, Joseph Grinnell, and William Russell invested settlements from the Alabama claims and the further industrialization of the city. This capital combined with the right economic, technology, and social conditions here in New Bedford brought about an era in this city's history, a new era in this city's history. As one late 19th century historian put it, New Bedford transitioned from, quote, whalers to weavers. Thank you all.